this week, maybe not next week. We'll just have to see how things are going. I'm a little somber. I got a call. I didn't share it with anybody yesterday, but or even when because you're taking the exam and everything like that. But but unfortunately, my son is being resurged in his ship. So when they surged, they're saying it was very unlikely he was going to go back and be deployed again, but they're being deployed again because of the situation. So, which unfortunately, the reason I'm sad about it is my very first question. Well, my first question was where, and the answer was very easy. Can't tell you. The second question was, what about Thanksgiving and Christmas? And the answer was very unlikely. And, when you have two little ones, you have a 6-year-old and a 3-year-old at home, it ain't fun to miss the big holidays and stuff like that. I said, we'll go down there, most likely we were going to go down anyway. He was supposed to be out at sea in November into early December. My son's they're being redeployed because of all the stuff's going on.
I'm pretty sure they're supposed to have it back.
Yeah, they maybe supposed to, but it's not going to happen.
If anything, I would really.
Yeah, well, hopefully. So we'll see what happens. Is he over there?
Huh?
Your guy?
Not yet, at least. But they said that it's just all rescue missions.
Yeah.
And nothing serious.
Well, if you saw there was a missile that was shot down allegedly that was a friend of his was a captain of that destroyer, so he could be very well in the same position. Yeah. They're like they want that to happen because they can shoot it down. Yeah. Where I was they didn't allow the 30 of us when we were on that mission, that Tiger cruise, which is friends and family. That was restricted. I mean, there were a couple areas in the ship you couldn't go through. That was one. So and so we'll see what happens. It's very troubling. The whole thing is very, very troubling. But long story short, what are you going to do? All right, let me go and begin. We're doing respiratory. So you can see the respiratory here. There is an outline. It's under, this is all, let me kind of summarize. I sent you, I'm sure you got the email with the study guide for the next one, because we're going to have to get that in before, the Thanksgiving break. You guys can figure out a date. Originally, I thought I might miss it, but because of that, that took away any idea of maybe trying to scoot out prior to Thanksgiving and skip down there, but not going to happen. So, part of my bad spelling, I don't know how to spell tertiary, but I digress. And the numbers changed. It's actually chapter 21. They changed the numbers around, and this was the old AP2 listing when I did it for CCAC many, many years ago. But it's got all the stuff. You're in the anatomy phase of the thing, and I do this in the physiology part, okay? And we go from there, and then this is all more about the physiology part, Haldane effect, chemical factors, but we touch on it a little bit. So I think it's a worthwhile read, and certainly a worthwhile resource, particularly for the anatomy part, for us to begin, and that's the jumping off point for this excursion into the respiratory system. And so we're doing the anatomy, and it's nearly almost the entirety of the anatomy is in this first PowerPoint, and it's relatively concise. I think the take-home point is geographically, this is a very small system, and you're talking about your nose and your mouth down to your diaphragm, so it fits in a relatively compact space, but there's an immense amount of surface area. It boggles the mind how much surface area there are. And you can summarize I've always summarized the respiratory system in a very easy phrase: in with the good air, out with the bad. And that's effectively what it does. You're basically just moving the air in and out and establishing the oxygen and carbon dioxide transport in the opposite directions, and reoxygenating the blood and expelling the largest, certainly, constituent of waste product, with the exception of water. And they're all coupled because everything has to be in balance. So the heart has to push the same amount of blood to the lungs as it's pushing to the rest of the body, and the lungs have to simultaneously be reoxygenating that same amount of blood so that it can be shipped out again in the next cycle when it goes on its way back to the heart and then eventually discharged into the aorta. And we just keep doing the whole thing over and over again. That's all they are. And yes, smell and speech are in there, but for maybe a slightly lesser role, not a less role. Terminology is interesting, and we'll get to both of them in today's presentation. We're getting to the point, and you might, with joints, we did a little bit of this. You have an anatomical criteria and you have physiological criteria. Okay, and a lot of times one's easier than the other. And to some extent, this is not the same. So where we had anatomical joints that didn't move and moved a little and moved freely, we used that criteria. Because the other one, there was really not a lot of overlap. Here it's different because the anatomical divide and what we call upper and lower respiratory is very distinctly anatomical. Okay, and roughly it's the larynx. And the way I've always done, the single most common diagnosis that we make medically is, and you've all had the diagnosis, URI, upper respiratory infection. That means it starts in the head, neck, nose, throat, and it may or may not extend into the larynx vis-a-vis laryngitis. When it starts in the larynx and works its way down, that's kind of more of a lower respiratory infection. So depending on the author, in this author uses the larynx as the start of the lower, that's fine. Okay, and that's the anatomical divide. The mass of surface area is certainly in the lower. And in general, not exclusively, upper respiratory problems are relatively easy to deal with and lower respiratory problems are not. The other divide is functional, and it's totally different. The vast majority of the transport system for air, which is all the branches starting with the trachea, and it divides into the main bronchi, secondary, tertiary, and 23 orders of division of lesser structures ending with bronchioles, the diminutive, very tiny, no longer visible to the naked eye. That is called the conducting system. Its whole job, based on pressure changes, is to move air in and out, whether it's air incoming or air outgoing. Once it gets to a point where those channels are so tiny, they opened up into these large sacs of cells called alveoli or alveoli, depending on how you want to pronounce it, or as I like to say, how you accent the syllable. It's a great line. Old English, Mrs. Ross, 6th grade English teacher. Her vocabulary builder. I can remember it like it was yesterday. Do you remember all? You're young. You should know all the names of like your grade school teachers, right? Most influential one was she was my 1st grade teacher, and then she was like our enrichment teacher for the quote smart kids, which for some reason they put me in. I wasn't anywhere near the smartest kid in my class. How's that? That's scary, isn't it? I mean, we have one guy go to Harvard Medical School. Okay, 4 people go to 2 to Harvard Law School. My buddy went to UCLA Law School, or he went to Stanford Law School. Out of Yale. Okay. What can I tell you? I was it. What can I say? Moving on. And so the way they do it here, that lower respiratory, what you've moved the air close enough to where the exchange takes place, okay, that we don't have to rely on moving it about. At that point, simple diffusion takes over. That's what it's all about. Oxygen and carbon dioxide moving simultaneously in opposite directions, roughly equally, to be able to either reoxygenate the blood or get rid of the carbon dioxide waste products. That's called the respiratory or exchange division, depending on the author. And why that's important is much more so in physiology, because we look at illnesses or defects. When it is affecting the conducting division, it limits the ability of air to move in and out. We call that an obstructive disorder. And these are mostly chronic respiratory conditions, and the poster child for this is called COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. And again, there's a variety of causes, and some of them overlap. The other disorders that affect the exchange or the respiratory division of these functional divisions are called restrictive disorder because they restrict the movement of oxygen and carbon dioxide at that level. The air can move in and out freely, but and again, sometimes both of these overlap. Okay, so restrictive disorders, and probably it's the most common of the restrictive disorders, and to some extent it overlaps, depending on how widespread it is with obstructive disorders, is emphysema. And again, emphysema has nothing to do with the lung, even though we associate it with the lung. Emphysema means trapped air. There's other places where air gets trapped, under the skin, for instance, in gas gangrene. We are probably going to have time to do some infectious disease enrichment stuff. In other words, it's more for us to sit around and chat about, and me to share, a fair amount of knowledge about infections, okay, with you and things like that, because we'll probably get done with this long before the last week. I'm sure we're going to have the whole last week pretty much done, maybe a little bit more. Since you guys never asked me a question. If you're stuck listening to me, not when is the test going to be? Did you scale the test? Did you grade? Not you. I'm not talking to you. Occasionally you ask a question. I'm picking on you today.
That's all right.
I have a question.
Yes, sir.
So, people who use like oxygen masks, wouldn't they have like acidic blood? Or not acidic, basic?
Yeah. The problem with the blood, and it's generally there's alterations in pH. It has a lot to do with either they're blowing off too much carbon dioxide or retaining. If you're retaining too much carbon dioxide, it pushes basically the carbonic acid. You're familiar with the carbonic acid buffer? That's the whole ball game is there. And so if you're retaining carbon dioxide, like you have lung problems, typically you have a certain amount of acidity. And it's more important to get the oxygen in than almost anything else. Because really your principal problem, you retain carbon dioxide, you very often there's insufficient, what cells and what areas are functional are not able to get as much oxygen. So you try to maximize it. Yeah, it's a little, people who are blowing off too much carbon dioxide. But we don't see that so often, okay? Acidosis is much more common than alkalosis. So respiratory alkalosis is typically people who hyperventilate. And the old standby still works, breathing into a paper bag, because you're inhaling abundant amounts of carbon dioxide. Whereas metabolic alkalosis, mostly from people who take antacids like candy, unless it's something really, the acidosis is much more common. Metabolic acidosis, most frequently diabetes, circulatory failure, heart disease, kidney disease, often. And respiratory is much more one of these disorders. I don't know if it answers the question, but the reason you use the oxygen, even in the face of pH irregularities that it might exacerbate, is it's still more important to get oxygen to the blood, to go to vital structures like your heart, your brain, your kidneys. Maybe that answers it better. Okay, I mean, so it's about that, and a lot of times you have to deal with the fallout some other way. And so, what really our focus point is anatomical. Now, in the second half of the course, in the physiology course, I have the technology is really good because we can do what are called pulmonary function studies. So, and those are the ones anybody with respiratory problems. This is the way we determine whether they have obstructive or restrictive disease. And I have 100 sterile things, not a mask, but it's something you seal, make a mouth seal with nose clips and blow in and out of. Athletes use them all the time for conditioning. And the technology works well with that. We work a lot more with the technology. So I try to have more hands-on labs, either doing the hands-on or doing the tech labs as much as possible. More so in that part of the program than in this part of the program. We're here, it's dissectionable. And like, we'll do the hard, obviously, on Monday. So the way the book characterizes it, I don't necessarily love it, but it's what they do. So you're familiar with it. To me, I don't think about it. To me, pulmonary respiration is external, what they call. In with the good air, out with the bad. Internal respiration is just the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide at the cellular level. I call that cellular respiration. So to me, pulmonary and cellular, the way I would better describe, I think it's easier to know about them. Transport, self-explanatory, and breathing is breathing. You want to call it pulmonary ventilation, that's fine, breathing. Works for me. And I mean, the neat thing about any of these is the interrelationship between the lungs and the heart and the distribution to the tissues. I mean, these are all illustrations that you have a certain degree of familiarity with. But the interesting part of it, and it just doesn't dawn on students, there's so much pressure on the left to get it all the way around. There's very little pressure on the right. So the concept here is we want to make sure we have maximum time for the blood to sort of, again, percolate through the area and acquire the exchange. So much so, I mean, the transition is like that. Like if you've had blood taken out of your arm out of a vein, the venous blood is much darker than what you see in the tube. That little bit of residual oxygen in that tube that they take, red top, purple top, whatever top, it's called a vacutainer. You know, when they pop it in there, immediately changes the color. Immediately. It's that fast. And same thing when you're bleeding, if you cut a vein, it's immediately exposed to scads and scads of oxygen and changes it right away. So you kind of get used to it. Blood's such an interesting thing, and I love that unit. Because I mean, when you're operating, blood's like it's in the way. I can't see as well. Do something about that. So, I don't get excited. I did a good deed today. My my feeling with neighbors is good neighbors. You really just, if I see somebody going to the house or catch it on fire, I'm gonna call the cops. I mean, I like to be left alone. I'm a homebody. Stay away. Are you two in the back listening to this anecdote?
Yes, we're making fun of the fact that you're like, just stay away.
It's all right. And so I'm walking the dog. I'm leaving for school. As soon as the dog finishes taking care of business, I do Bachman Turner overdrive in there, taking care of business. Who originally with the Guess Who, by the way. That floats your boat. Old time rock and roll. And what do I see on the ground? A cell phone, intact, and clearly going to be a lady's phone because a lot of times you'll have like your driver's license and your card and like a little holder on it. And I looked at it, and it was my across the street neighbor's license. And she did what I've done too many times. You're busy. She's got two little kids. And you throw them in the car, and you put something on the roof of the car, and you drive off, and then boom. She must have left her phone up there for whatever reason. I knew exactly what happened. And then as I'm starting to walk the dog back, I couldn't have been more than 100 feet away. I said, I got it. So I did my good deed. I didn't try to sell it on eBay. Hey, I was an iPhone 15. Hey, I could have done all right with that. So I guess we'll be back on her Christmas card list. Yeah, people, decorations everywhere. We got a guy for Halloween. He must have 100 inflatables. Easy. I got to take a picture one way. I've never seen that many inflatables in my life, and it's worse for Christmas. But moving on. So let's get back to the anatomy part of the program after me bragging about my good deed for the day. If you remember that, Steelers, Manchester United, Man City, Sunday, Steelers at 1. You only can have one, make it the Steelers, because I don't think they're likely to beat City anyway. Does it hurt to ask? What's the worst? What's the worst response? No. My dad always said that. What's the worst thing you can say? No. I want to raise. No. Okay. Upper respiratory, nose, nasal cavity, sinuses, throat, pharynx. Mouth's not in here. Mouth is more classically associated with digestive, but obviously it plays a role. We do more inhaling through our nose, more exhaling through our mouth, for sure. Lower respiratory, in this textbook, larynx, trachea, bronchi and its branches, lungs, and alveoli. Relatively small system. The nasal cavity, much larger than you think. We do the pharynx more than once because there's three divisions, as you will see. The one part behind the nose called the nasopharynx, the part behind the mouth called the oropharynx, and the last part, most inferiorly, immediately behind the start of the laryngeal area, the laryngopharynx. And obviously the epiglottis is a very important part of it. It's one of the two areas where we have elastic cartilage. The other is our ear in our body. If you remember when we took through the bones and cartilage unit early on in the course, and obviously when we swallow, that flap of cartilage covers the throat or the entry to the laryngeal area, so the food will pass posterior to it down the esophagus. So, and the whole idea of this system, it's really not based on bone. Yeah, there's a nasal bone and there's bones in the skull and facial bones that are around it, but the patency, the keeping it open, is all about cartilage. And with the exception of the epiglottis, the only cartilage that's there is hyaline cartilage. So all of that, it's like the costal cartilage is in your ribs, hyaline cartilage, okay? Because technically that's all about respiratory more than anything else. But all the rings of the trachea, all the bronchial rings, the cartilage around the larynx, your Adam's apple, with the exception of the epiglottis, are all hyaline cartilage. Okay? A certain inherent amount of flexibility is associated with it, et cetera, et cetera. And then you can see the mass of surface area that allows this blood is in the lungs. Not so much about the cartilaginous part, which makes up the air passageways, but around these sort of openings and clusters of cells. And the best analogy ever for those clusters of cells are something like, if you've ever done it, and we sell them if you're interested, puzzle balls. They're like jigsaw puzzles that form, they're shaped puzzles that form, not flat shaped puzzles like a ball. Love them. Just saying, if you're interested, Cordy Blue on Amazon, look at our store, please. Cordy Blue, CORDYBOUE. Why is it called? That's your next question. Why would you call it that? Because my wife nicknamed herself, she didn't like Patty for some reason. She thought she'd be better as a Cordelia, and she always wore blue jeans. So Cordy Blue is for Cordy Blue jeans. Yes, we do. TPR, TPG, Toys, Puzzles, and Games. Squishmallows. Oh, because you're not allowed to sell them anymore. We sell all sorts of stuff.
Oh, I found a squishmallow. Oh, no, hot dog.
A what?
A hot dog. Oh, no, it looks like oh, it looks like
I kid you not. During the lockdown, we sold in November, December for the fourth quarter. We probably sold 1,000 squishmallows, 8-inch squishmallows. Our house was a warehouse. Guy, honest to goodness, a guy we got them in Costco, and they ship by Amazon. They don't ship, they ship independently. And I think it was a UPS. And he had a little, like a UPS truck, was a rental, like a rider rental. He goes, I have a delivery. I said, well, just leave it here in front of the garage. Well, I'll take it inside. He goes, it's the whole truck, sir. All over. Goodwills, thrift stores, garage sales, yard sales, online. I just listed some stuff today that was on deal from Target or from Walmart. If they will go to Target and Walmart, look for clearance aisles, scan them. I mean, on your.
You got some good movies up.
Oh, we have a ton of DVDs. Tons of DVDs. We have it's when you're an Amazon seller, you have any eBay sellers have it. It's an app like that. You can scan the barcodes and find out what it is. I mean, that's what you do with it. Okay. So you put. We'll see if it comes up. Here we go. Oh, you see an individual Fresca 7-ounce can not in there, so it's just not there. But if you have something else that you had handy, it might very well show. Or you could just take a picture of it. Been doing it for a while.
Would I ever get a discount if I order?
No,
Really?
a hearty handshake,
Wait, handshake?
hearty handshake, and our undying appreciation.
What about like, do I need to pay for delivery?
No, most of the stuff is Prime.
Well, like, could you just like, instead of shipping it, can you just like hand it to me?
If it's cash, we'll talk. No, when you see, understand your business relationship is with Amazon. Our business relationship is with Amazon, not with you. Understand that? If people don't understand about Amazon resellers, we deal with Amazon, Amazon deals with you. Even if we fulfill it, even if we have it in the house and we bag it or box it and ship it to you, you're buying it from Amazon. So if you try to circumvent that, and somehow Amazon would find out, you can get kicked off. And all you have to do is sneeze wrong and they'll kick you off these days. Moving on. So let's look at the parts that are there. In the upper respiratory system, the nose, the only part that's outside, and obviously it's the airway. It does several things. It moistens, warms, and filters the air. The filtration is part of your immune system. It takes little particles out. Okay, moistening. The mucus that you have has a certain moisture component. This plays a role, obviously, in smell and in other things. And moist is a little bit too much moisture for breathing is bad. Not enough moisture is it doesn't make as efficient the oxygen doing the transition for going from basically crossing the barrier. So it has to have a certain amount of moisture. And temperature is important. The closer it is to body temperature, the easier the movement. You guys know this from chemistry. You know this from basic ideas of physiology, that we work around body temperature. If you're too high or too low, it creates problems efficiently, moving molecules from point A to point B. And yet, speech and olfactory. And I don't deal with a lot with the. If you're buying something, fine. Anna, did you find anything you want to buy?
No.
She didn't?
Are you? What? Are you shopping? No, I'm looking. No.
What are you looking at that's so funny?
Nothing. It's a long story. We don't have time. Yeah.
I always wonder what's going behind those
You
screens.
probably don't want to know.
I don't want to know. You know, there are restrictions if you're using the school's internet. You're using their Wi-Fi. Some of those sites that you can get into trouble for. You know that's part of your agreement. So stop looking at that. Whatever it is, don't. I'm sure I don't want to know this. You're awful.
I love the external nose. Keep talking about the nose.
I will talk about the nose. The root of the nose between those eyebrows is the only bony part, the nasal bone. Okay? So we call that the bridge of the nose. Everything else, I don't care about. I mean, I am not interested at all in any of this. It's mostly cartilage. They have a bunch of names. If you go on to a professional medical school, veterinary school, you end up having to memorize all these names. Okay? So I don't care about any of this. Okay? And I'm never going to ask you a question with all these different cartilages. Inherently, it's very, very flexible and forgiving. So a lot of times when someone has a damage, they break their nose. Breaking their nose technically should be the nasal bone. A lot of time we misinterpret it because their nose is distorted in an accident or something like that, or in a sporting event. you can bring that back and splint it, and typically it will hold. Okay, sometimes there's some residual damage that's there because between the cartilage and the connective tissue, it'll hold pretty good. Obviously, the septum is cartilaginous here. When you go backwards, you remember the vomer and you remember the perpendicular plate. That those are important. And the nose has a lot of surface area, where it runs into the nasopharynx and all those things on the ethmoid that are there. And I really don't care about it. Hairs and the nose hairs are really an important part, more of your immune system. And you have two types of mucosa that are there. You have ones that are typically higher up that are more often than not associated with smell. The olfactory epithelium, which you probably remember a little bit when we looked at the cranial nerves. And respiratory, and this is critical, the principle, other than the entry where it's stratified squamous non-keratinizing, as soon as you either get olfactory or respiratory changes, and the principal epithelia of your respiratory system is pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelia with goblet cells. And remember, it's ciliated. And the whole idea of the cilia is that mucus, one of its major roles other than moisturizing, is to trap particles, whether they're invaders or environmental particles, trap them, and the cilia sweep them eventually towards your mouth so you can expel them in some way, shape, or form. Whether you spit them out, whether you swallow them, however you deal with them. So tons of those. Okay. So mucus secreting cells, mostly there's a certain amount of watery serous cells and there's a lot of defensive compounds when we get back to this unit, which succeeds the immune system, but we'll get back to it. You have lysozyme and defensins, particles and chemicals that deal with invading things. We'll get to that. And then everything else is the sweeping effect, either back down toward the mouth or from the larynx up toward the mouth or from behind the mouth, the oropharynx, out, so we can expel them in some way, shape, or form. And yeah, there's lots of different things depending on the particles. They can be irritants. The conchae, you might remember, part of the superior and middle are associated with the ethmoid bone. The inferior technically are bones by themselves, if you want to consider them that. And I typically do not. And they are just about surface area. So you have an immense amount it's like an animal's nose having a large amount of surface area, while some of them are. Look, if I get something to eat, the dog is my best friend immediately. He could be somewhere else. He could be downstairs. I could be upstairs. It's like, oh, what's on the menu, Dad? It's snack time. And then I have this large head on my knee. Friends of ours had a daughter like that. She'd walk around with her mouth open in case food fell off the table. It's terrible. Oh, it's hysterical. She grew up into she's got to be 40 years old now. She's a very pretty girl. What? I have no idea. We used to joke about that. Her dad's a veterinarian. Her mom was involved with running like the, for animal shelters. So they were all animal people, but we used to joke about that. It was so hysterical. But she was great. She was a really nice kid. Kind of lost touch with her from the days when my kids we've all moved on in different directions. Okay, and I don't see a whole lot else here. Moistening, filtering, reclaiming heat and moisture. So there's a certain amount of interest. It's really important. Okay, that's there. There's 4 paranasal sinuses. I always use the acronym FEMS, frontal, ethmoid, sphenoid, and maxillary. Whatever works for you, use. Those are when they say paranasal, even though the mastoid has air sinuses that sort of play as amplifiers for hearing. And they could think what your sinuses are when you get a sinus headache here. Frontal, maxillary, sphenoid, ethmoid sort of deep and above, and sphenoid is kind of behind it. I think that's important. That's there. They don't show them to you particularly well. But if we go back, there's all of these in the nasal cavity are openings. The sinuses are like little cul-de-sacs. And the good news is, they sort of lighten it to a certain extent. But if there's things get trapped in there, then you get sinus infections. And the largest opening for sure is back here. That's the opening goes into the nasopharynx. That's your eustachian or pharyngotympanic or auditory tube, whatever the heck you want to call it. And so inflammation of, very simple, sinusitis, fairly straightforward. And again, they don't focus on it too much here. I mean, I'm flipping around. Yeah, again, they don't show you that opening so much. This is one of the, and I'm very fond of these, and we deal with it a little. I deal with it more when I do micro, and I realize that's what, and it's something we can talk about. There's two within the respiratory system. There are two areas that are associated with the anatomical basis of disease. Okay, why do 2 to 4-year-olds get an abundance of middle ear infections? Because that tube is very horizontal up until about age, but between age 2 and 4, it begins to decline as the baby and then the infant and then the toddler enlarges. So imagine when a baby's sleeping, it's straining right back against their eardrum. The flip side of that, okay, is, once it's declinated, now you get that postnasal drip that we get as adults. And sometimes you'll wake up with a cold with a funny taste or stuff that's accumulated. The other one that's so important, we're going to see, perhaps we won't get to it exactly today, is when the bronchi divide. The bronchi on the right, so your trachea divides into two bronchi, the right main and the left main bronchi. It's not a divide like that. It's not like the iliac arteries dividing, okay? The right nearly goes straight down into your lung. The left basically makes a left turn and goes over the heart. So where our most pneumonias are byproduct of things by gravity that are in your nose and in your throat, that particles make their way down. So most pneumonia are right-sided as opposed to left. Particles can go straight. It's a lot harder to make a left turn. So a little bit there. The pharynx effectively is an open tunnel. It's funnel-like, but open anteriorly into those three areas. It's skeletal muscle. Effectively, it facilitates swallowing by the three pharyngeal constrictors. They play really the glossopharyngeal is the principal nervous innervation for that. Naso, oro, and again, laryngo, you can see the areas that are there. The nasopharynx, pseudostratified. It changes to stratified squamous, but when we get down toward the mouth and to a certain extent into the throat, the laryngopharynx. But once we get through the larynx, now we're going back to pseudostratified ciliated columnar. Yes, we've got tonsils, and adenoids are really just a tonsil that are far back in the posterior wall of the nasopharynx that are there. Frequently, when you have removed tonsils, you end up removing adenoids. Understand that we don't do it as much anymore, though two of my kids, because of recurrent infections, I had those done when they were about 11 or 12, my oldest and my youngest. In my day and age, if you had two earaches, they took out your tonsils. They thought that was the source of the problem. So in 1955, 56, 57, my age, boom, tonsils out. Busiest doctor I ever saw was the ear, nose, and throat doctor. I've never seen an office with that many people in it. Constantly. He must have made a small fortune. Everybody I grew up with had their tonsils taken out by the same doctor at the same hospital. So again, oropharynx, now we're a shared system, stratified squamous, more tonsils. Laryngopharynx, still a shared system until we get to the epiglottis, and then it's still stratified squamous. The change occurs then. We stay with stratified squamous when we go into the esophagus until it gets into the simple columnar that you'll see is the hallmark epithelia of the gastrointestinal system, stomach, small, and large intestine, but differs because once we get through the laryngeal area, now we're going to return back to pseudostratified squamous, pseudociliated. Okay, so all of these things, they can block air passage, not properly moistened or dealt with until it reaches the lungs. There can be a lot of significant effects from this. And so the big it's probably what we're going to get through today is the last part of this is larynx and perhaps the trachea. We'll deal with the bronchi and the lungs on Monday. We have two zones. Again, the respiratory zone, and all of these structures we're not going to see those until we get very close and we have an open to the alveoli. The rest is the conducting zone, and it's all about air movement, cleansing, warming, etc. The larynx, your voice box. I don't do anything about speaking or how that is produced. I really don't have a lot of expertise. We do see a lot of involvement with soft tissue and muscular structures attached to that hyoid bone. So what is the main deal other than for the larynx? Keeping the airway open against cartilage, air and food, the epiglottis, proper channels, voice productions. There are classically 9 cartilages associated with the larynx. The only ones I worry about are the big 3. Those are the thyroid cartilage, whose anterior prominence, it's like an anterior shield to your voice box, that we call the Adam's apple. The cricoid cartilage, which is ring-shaped and actually a little larger in the back, so it prevents sort of like the bat, sort of guards the posterior aspect of the larynx. And again, the epiglottis, because of its being elastic cartilage. The paired arytenoid and cuneiform and cuniculate, again, classic anatomy, graduate level anatomy are there. The epiglottis, again, the only area with elastic cartilage, covers the inlet during swallowing. Taste buds are on it. Talks about that a little bit. There's certain things that, you kind of feel that. In cooking, we call that the finish for certain things that we use. You can actually palpate with some difficulty the hyoid. Here's the laryngeal prominence, which of the thyroid cartilage, I call the Adam's apple. It enlarges right around puberty. Variety of ligaments are there, so you can palpate some of these structures. Better illustration. Here's the hyoid. Here's the epiglottis projecting slightly above it. Here you can see a certain amount of membranous material that's there. The laryngeal prominence, everybody, again, is this large. So it's this large shield, quite wide anteriorly, not so posteriorly, even though it encircles it. Where the cricoid cartilage below it is actually a bit wider posteriorly, but not inconsequential anteriorly. And then what it transitions to then are rings. The tracheal rings are incomplete. They're C-shaped, oriented horizontally, open posterior. And think of it, there's a muscular structure called the trachealis on the posterior aspect, and there's a certain amount of give, because when food passes through the esophagus, if they were ring-shaped, it might really prevent food from moving. If someone accidentally ingested something that didn't compress properly, or basically, pardon the expression, bit off more than they can chew. That's like why I always cut a pizza into 6 pieces, not 8, because I can't eat 8. I can eat 6.
So how come, like, men have an Adam's apple, but
You do, it's just not as prominent. It has probably more to do with circulating testosterone. There are some women, unfortunately, who do have a rather prominent Adam's apple, and a lot of times when that's the case, they'll elect to cosmetically deal with it. Not everybody does, but there's some that do. Hey, I've had cosmetic surgery.
For what? Yes.
Jewish nose syndrome, JNS. My nose used to be down to like here.
what? Oh, you used the hypoglossal nerve of that. Bonus points. Bonus points. Bonus points. That was good.
Lord knows you could have used it.
Good work. Hey, hey,
there's a certain interplay that's there. Thank goodness you knew that.
You're welcome.
Other than that,
All right, you're being dramatic.
I'm not being that dramatic, people.
Yeah, you are.
Oh, Bolo. Oh, for whom? I go through it going, how can I make it this easy?
You are a doctor, okay?
Yeah.
Wow.
Oh, goodness. So I don't do anything with the vocal cords at all. I just don't. The opening is called the glottis. Again, the transition, once you really effectively get below it, now we're into pseudostratified ciliated. I mean, we always see this illustration. This is the posterior aspect. Here's the epiglottis folding down. The cricoid larger posteriorly. Let me just do this. So, and there's the openings where it's, I mean, it's really, this was the opening and closing is very, I don't understand it that well. So about voice production and things like that. Obviously there's a whole lot of factors that are involved that are there. We do close that if we try to, like, if you're trying to go to the bathroom and by the same time you're lifting something, you're building up pressure. So there's a lot of things that you can, that will cause this Valsalva maneuver that are there. And laryngitis, obviously inflammation of a lot of things that impact it. And then we get to I'll show you the rings of the trachea, because we're about ready to be done. Or we probably should be done. Well, I'll hold off and we'll pick up with that on Monday.